People have this image of the Middle Ages. They see long wooden tables in a castle hall. There are roaring fires and massive feasts, and on the table next to every person is a goblet. It's always filled with wine. Knights, ladies, even the common folk in the corner seem to be drinking it. Movies and books have cemented this idea in our minds. The idea is that medieval people drank wine with every meal, all the time. But that picture isn't quite right. The simple answer to the question is no. Most medieval people did not drink wine with every meal. For a huge part of the population, wine was a rare treat, or something they never tasted at all. The reality of what people drank was much more complicated. It depended on three big things: who you were, where you lived, and what was available. Let's start with the who you were part. Medieval society was strictly layered. At the top, you had the king, the great lords, and high-ranking churchmen like bishops. Below them were knights, wealthy merchants, and other well-off people. And at the very bottom, making up the vast majority, were the peasants. They were the farmers and laborers who worked the land. These groups lived in completely different worlds, and their drinking habits were just as different. For a powerful duke or a rich merchant, wine was indeed a daily drink. It was a status symbol. Serving fine wine from France or Spain showed off your wealth and connections. It was like driving a luxury car today. It sent a message. Their cellars were stocked with barrels of it. For them, a meal without wine would have felt incomplete, even poor. But for a peasant family living in a small village, wine was a different story. It was an expensive luxury. Their lives were about survival. They grew their own food and made most of what they needed. The cash they earned was scarce and needed for things they couldn't make, like salt or metal tools. Spending that precious money on wine would have been unthinkable for most. Their daily drink was something cheaper, something they could produce themselves. This brings us to the what was available part. The choice of drink was a practical one. You drank what you could get easily and affordably. Wine is made from grapes. Grapes need a specific climate to grow well. They need long, sunny, warm summers. If you lived in an area that could grow grapes, wine was more common. If you didn't, it had to be imported, and that made it expensive. So the third factor, where you lived, is maybe the most important of all. Europe had, and still has, a sort of dividing line. You can think of it as a wine belt and a beer belt. Southern Europe, places like France, Spain, and Italy were the heart of the wine belt. The grapes grew everywhere. Here, even ordinary people might drink wine. It wouldn't be the fine stuff the lords drank. It would be a rough, cheap, local wine, sometimes watered down. But it was part of the culture. North of this line, in places like England, Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia, was the beer belt. The climate was cooler and wetter. It was perfect for growing grains like barley and wheat, but not so good for grapes. So here the common drink for everyone, from the lord to the peasant, was ale or beer. A nobleman in England would certainly have wine in his cellar for special occasions and important guests. He would have bought it from traders who brought it by ship from Bordeaux or Spain. But his daily ordinary drink and the drink of his entire household would likely have been ale. So, the popular image of constant wine drinking is a snapshot of a very small, very wealthy part of society, living in a specific part of Europe. It mistakes the life of the 1% for the life of everyone. The reality was a lot more varied. It was a world where your cup was filled based on your wallet and your local weather. For most people, that cup held ale, not wine. While most people weren't drinking wine daily, the ones who did made it a central part of their lives. For the nobility and the senior clergy, wine wasn't just a drink. It was a symbol of power, a display of wealth, and an essential part of their social and religious worlds. Imagine a feast in a great castle. The lord and his most important guests sit at a high table, raised on a platform above everyone else. The food comes out in grand processions. There are roasted swans, intricate pies, and mountains of meat. And with every course, there is wine. It was a performance, and wine was a key player. The person in charge of the wine cellar, the butler, was a high-ranking servant. His job was to select, care for, and serve the wine. The types of wine served were also important. A local, common wine might be served to the lower-ranking people in the hall, but for the high table, the lord would bring out the good stuff. This meant imported wines. Gascon wine, from a region in France then controlled by the English crown, was hugely popular in England. It was a light red wine, we would call a claret today. There were also sweet, strong wines from the Mediterranean, like Malmsey from Greece or Vernaccia from Italy. These were dessert wines, incredibly expensive and prized. Serving these showed you were not just rich, but sophisticated. Wine was also often doctored. Medieval tastes were different from ours. They loved strong, spicy flavors. It was common to add spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and grains of paradise to wine, along with sugar or honey. This created a drink called hippocras. This wasn't necessarily to cover up the taste of bad wine, though it could help with that. It was because they believed spices were good for your health and digestion. A cup of spiced hippocras at the end of a heavy meal was seen as a medicinal aid as much as a pleasure. Beyond the feast, wine was woven into the fabric of noble life. Business deals were sealed over wine. Political alliances were discussed with a cup in hand. A gift of a barrel of fine wine was a serious gesture of respect or favor. It was a social lubricant and a tool of diplomacy. To be without wine was to be seen as poor or insignificant. Chronicles from the time are filled with details about the vast quantities of wine consumed by royal courts. The household accounts of kings and great lords show enormous sums spent on it. The other great consumer of wine was the church. Wine was, and is, essential to the Christian faith. It is used in the central ritual of the Mass, symbolizing the blood of Christ. Every church and monastery needed a reliable supply. This religious necessity made the church one of the largest producers and landowners in medieval Europe. Monasteries, in particular, became centers of winemaking excellence. Monks had the time, the land, and the dedication to perfect the art of viticulture. They kept careful records, experimented with different grape varieties, and developed techniques for pressing, fermenting, and storing wine. The Benedictine and Cistercian orders were famous for their vineyards. In regions like Burgundy in France, it was the monks who first identified and cultivated the specific plots of land that produce the world's most famous wines today. For the monks, wine was part of their daily life. Their rules, like the rule of St. Benedict, allowed for a daily ration of wine. It was seen as a gift from God, to be used in moderation, but it was also a practical source of income. The monasteries sold their surplus wine, and the profits helped to fund their operations, from building great cathedrals to caring for the poor. A bishop or an abbot lived much like a great lord. His household would consume large amounts of wine, and he would serve fine vintages to his guests. So for this small but powerful slice of medieval society, wine was everywhere. It was in their feasts, their politics, and their prayers. It marked them as separate from the common folk who toiled in the fields. It was a taste of power, a luxury that defined their elevated place in the world. Their consumption was so visible and so well documented that it's easy to see why it has come to dominate our picture of the entire era. Well, if the rich had their wine, what did everyone else drink? For the 90% of the population who were peasants, laborers, and simple townspeople, the answer was almost always ale or beer. This was the true drink of the masses, the fuel that powered medieval Europe. The reasons for this were simple and practical. Ale was made from grain, usually barley, but sometimes oats, wheat, or a mix. Grain grew almost everywhere in Europe, especially in the cooler northern climates where grapes struggled. Every village was surrounded by fields of it. This meant the raw material for ale was cheap and plentiful. Unlike wine, which required a whole year of tending vines for one harvest, grain could be grown and harvested relatively quickly. The process of making ale was also straightforward enough that it could be done in the home. Many households, particularly in the countryside, brewed their own. The job of brewing often fell to the women of the house, who were known as wives. They would take the grain, let it sprout to create malt, mash it with hot water, and then let it ferment. The result was a thick, cloudy, and nutritious drink. It's important to understand what this ale was like. It wasn't the clear, fizzy, hoppy beer we know today. Hops, which act as a preservative and add a bitter flavor, were not widely used in much of Europe until the later Middle Ages. So traditional ale was unhopped, sweetish, and had a very short shelf life. It had to be drunk within a few days before it soured and went bad. This is another reason it was made locally, in small batches. Medieval ale came in different strengths. There was the strong, potent stuff, saved for holidays, weddings, and celebrations. This was the ale that made you merry, but the everyday drink was something else, often called small ale or small beer. This was made by reusing the grain from a stronger batch. It was much weaker in alcohol, probably only 1 or 2%. Small ale was not really an intoxicant, it was a source of hydration and, crucially, calories. A peasant's diet could be monotonous and meager, consisting mainly of bread and a vegetable stew called pottage. Small ale added vital nutrition and hundreds of calories to their daily intake. It was a liquid food. People from all walks of life, including children, drank it. It was safer than drinking from a potentially contaminated stream, and it provided energy for a long day of hard physical labor in the fields. A farmer might take a leather bottle or a wooden keg of small ale with him to work. In towns and cities, brewing became more commercial. alehouses sprang up everywhere. They were the center of social life for the common person. It was where people went after work to relax, exchange news, gossip, and play games. The alehouse was the poor man's social club. The quality and price of ale were serious business. Towns had official ale conners, whose job was to taste the ale and make sure it was good quality and being sold at a fair price. As bad brewers could be fined or publicly shamed. Of course, ale wasn't the only alternative to wine. In certain regions, other drinks were popular. In places with lots of apple orchards, like Normandy in France or Western England, people drank cider. This was made by pressing apples and fermenting the juice. Where pears were plentiful, they made a similar drink called perry. In colder northern lands like Scandinavia or Russia, where even grain could be scarce, they might make mead from fermented honey. Yes, but these were regional specialties. Across the vast beer belt of northern Europe, ale was king. It was the drink of the home, the field, and the tavern. It was cheap, nutritious, and readily available. While the lord in his castle might be sipping a fine French wine, the people who worked his lands were drinking a simple, hearty ale they had made themselves. It's a much less glamorous image, but it's a far more accurate picture of daily life for the overwhelming majority of people in the Middle Ages. Where you lived in medieval Europe had a massive impact on what you drank. You can't understand the question of wine without looking at a map. The continent was divided by climate, which in turn divided it by drink. This geographical reality was more powerful than any king's decree. Let's start in the south in what we can call the wine belt. This region stretched across Portugal, Spain, the southern half of France, and Italy. Here, the sun was hot, the summers were long, and grapevines grew on nearly every hillside. Wine was not a foreign luxury, it was a local agricultural product. It was part of the very fabric of life. In these areas, wine was much more accessible to the common person. A peasant farmer in Tuscany might have a few rows of vines alongside his olive trees and grain. He would make his own wine for his family's consumption. It would be a simple, rough, young wine, nothing like the aged vintages the nobles drank. It might be mixed with water to make it last longer and to lessen its strength, but it would be on his table for his main meal. For him and his neighbors, wine was the default drink. Beer was the strange, foreign beverage of the northerners. The cities in this region, like Bordeaux, Florence, or Barcelona, were built on the wine trade. The economy revolved around the grape harvest. The rivers were filled with barges carrying barrels of wine to port cities from where they would be shipped all over Europe. For a laborer living in one of these cities, wine was cheap. It might even have been part of his wages. The local tavern would serve mugs of local wine, not ale. Now, let's travel north, across the Loire River in France, or over the Alps. We are now in the beer belt. This includes northern France, the Low Countries, England, Germany, and Scandinavia. Here the landscape changes. The weather is cooler, damper, and less reliable. These are not ideal conditions for growing grapes. While some regions, like the Rhine Valley in Germany, did produce wine, it was much less common. The dominant crops were grains like barley, wheat, and rye. For a farmer in England, the idea of having his own vineyard was a fantasy. The land was for grain and livestock. His drink was ale, brewed from his own barley. For him, wine was something utterly foreign. It came from a ship, from a place called Gascony or Spain. It was sold by merchants in the towns for a high price. It was the Lord's drink. He might get a taste of it on a special feast day, like Christmas or a wedding, when the Lord might share a barrel with his tenants as a sign of generosity. But it was not part of his daily life. The contrast was stark. A traveler going from Rome to London would have noticed the shift. In the inns of Italy and southern France, he would be served wine with his meal. As he moved north, it would become rarer and more expensive. By the time he reached an English tavern, the common drink on offer would be a foaming pot of ale. This geographical divide even created cultural stereotypes. Northerners were sometimes seen by Southerners as heavy, slow beer drinkers. Southerners, in turn, could be viewed as more fiery and passionate, fueled by wine. These ideas were, of course, exaggerations, but they show how deeply the local drink was tied to identity. The trade routes were the arteries that connected these two worlds. The English, for example, had a huge appetite for wine, which their own climate couldn't satisfy. So every year, a massive fleet of ships would sail to Bordeaux to load up with the year's vintage. This trade was incredibly important for the economies of both England and the Gascony region of France. Wine was a major international commodity like oil is today, but even with this trade, the fundamental reality didn't change. Transporting heavy barrels by ship and then overland by cart was expensive. Every mile it traveled, the price of wine went up. So while a wealthy merchant in London could afford to drink French wine, the price was far beyond the reach of the average person. Geography created a basic economic fact where grapes grew, wine was common. Where they didn't, it was a luxury. The line on the map separating the vineyard from the barley field was the single most important factor in determining what was in a medieval person's cup. The final piece of this story has to do with health, water, and daily practicalities. There's a very common myth that says medieval people only drank alcohol because the water was poisonous. Like many myths, there's a grain of truth to it, but it's a huge oversimplification. The real situation was more nuanced. First, let's address the water. Was it really that bad? It depends entirely on where you were. In a crowded, dirty medieval city like London or Paris, the main river was often an open sewer. People dumped all sorts of waste into it. Drinking water directly from the Thames in the middle of London would have been a very bad idea, and people knew it. It was smelly, visibly dirty, and likely to make you sick. In these urban environments, people sought out cleaner sources. They dug wells to tap into groundwater. Monasteries and wealthy households often had their own private wells. Cities also built conduits, stone or lead pipes that brought fresh water in from springs outside the city walls. This water was much safer. Out in the countryside, where most people lived, the situation was completely different. A village might be situated next to a clear, fast-flowing stream or have a local spring. The water from these sources was generally clean and safe to drink. People drank water every day. Farm laborers working in the hot sun would drink water from a stream, not just ale. The idea that no one ever drank water is simply not true. So why were alcoholic drinks so popular? Because they were reliable. The process of fermentation, whether for wine or ale, kills most of the harmful bacteria and pathogens that can live in water. A cask of wine or a barrel of ale was a guaranteed safe source of hydration. You didn't have to wonder if it was clean. It always was. So while good water was available, ale and wine were a safer bet, especially if your local water source was questionable. They offered peace of mind. The safety aspect made them more than just recreational drinks. They were a fundamental part of the medieval diet. As we've seen, small ale provided calories and nutrients. Wine was also seen as having health benefits. Medieval medicine was based on the idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It was all about keeping them in balance. Wine, especially red wine, was considered hot and dree. It was believed to aid digestion, cheer the spirit, and create good blood. Doctors would often prescribe specific types of wine, sometimes mixed with herbs as medicine. Wine was a core ingredient in the medieval pharmacy. But there were also times when wine wasn't the answer. What about children? While they did drink small ale, they also drank water and milk if it was available. Milk was a valuable food source, often turned into cheese or butter to preserve it, but children and the sick would drink it fresh. Religion also placed limits on drinking. The season of Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was a time of fasting and penance. This often meant abstaining from or cutting back on wine and rich food. Some of the stricter monastic orders forbade wine altogether, or allowed it only for the sick or on major feast days. Moderation was always held up as a virtue by the church, even if the nobles and clergy didn't always practice it. Drunkenness was a sin. So, when we put it all together, the picture becomes much clearer. The idea of everyone drinking wine with every meal is a fantasy. It's a vision focused on the wine-drinking habits of the rich and powerful, who left behind the most records. The reality for the vast majority of people was shaped by simple, practical concerns. What you drank depended on where you lived. If you were in the warm south, you might have cheap local wine. If you were in the cool north, you would drink ale. What you drank depended on your social status. If you were a lord, you drank expensive imported wine to show off your wealth. If you were a peasant, you drank cheap, homemade ale for calories and hydration. And what you drank depended on the situation. You might drink water from a clean well, but choose ale when you were in a dirty city. You might celebrate with strong ale, but drink weak, small ale while working. The choice was not about luxury or pleasure for most people. It was about practicality, economy, and survival. The medieval world was not a place of constant feasting and flowing wine. It was a world where a simple cup of safe, nourishing drink was a daily necessity, and for most, that drink was not wine.